time for the next talk by Nannearl. Nannearl is a UX researcher in Figma. Nannearl, how are you? Hello, welcome.
Hi, how are you doing?
Well, it's good to have you. So you're going to be sharing with us how to conduct diary studies as part of user research.
Yeah,
I'll leave you to it. Thank you so much.
awesome. Oh, let's see. I'm gonna make this full screen so that everyone can see. Hopefully that is better. um, but hey everyone, I am Nannearl, as was mentioned before, and I'm going to be talking to you all about conducting diary studies. So we're just going to hop right in. So really quickly, before I get started, what we're going to be talking about today, I will do a quick intro of myself, and then we'll dive into what diary studies actually are and why we do them. And then we'll get into some pros and cons about diary studies, and then we'll jump into the main portion of this presentation, which will be the tools and tips for conducting diary studies. Cool. So I'm Nannearl, as was mentioned before, and I am a UX researcher at Figma, and I do research for the growth team. So I do mostly qualitative research, a lot of talking to customers and potential customers, and really understanding what their experience is like when they first get onto Figma. And outside of work, I do a few things as well. I have a YouTube channel called Unpacked Angles, where I talk a little bit about UX and self-care and all of that jazz from my perspective, just to widen the perspective a little bit more. And I also have a community, started a community on Clubhouse, if you've heard of the app, called UX Research Corner. It's growing. It's really cool to see other researchers on the platform sharing their experiences and just really crowdsourcing knowledge from other resources or researchers. So it's pretty cool. But enough about me. We're going to get into what diary studies actually are and why they're important. So, what is a diary study? Basically, a diary study is a type of research study that lasts over a span of time. So, either a few days, maybe a few weeks, sometimes a few months. And that is also called a longitudinal study, where we're trying to elicit specific information. And so, just really trying to understand something depending on our goals from our participants over a span period of time. And what's interesting is that for diary studies, actually it started out with like sending a physical diary or journal to participants to log in their information, submit their entries, and then they used to send those diaries back to the person who was conducting that study. Don't have to do that anymore. That was kind of back in the day. We have a lot of resources at our fingertips now, but it's really interesting how those got started and how they're still really important to do today. And so why do we do them? Well, it allows us to be the fly on the wall without actually having to be in the room, right? So sometimes it can be a little weird, kind of creepy feeling, especially for the participant when we're doing observation studies, because nobody really likes to be watched. And sometimes that can feel uncomfortable. So this is a really great way to do this digitally and get a sense of what people's actual experience is and their genuine experience. So when we want to learn behaviors that are natural or understand activities that people are doing just on their day-to-day, a diary study is a really good way to get this information. And it's especially useful right now because a lot of us are doing remote work because of the pandemic. And so instead of being in the room observing and in the room doing contextual interviews, which is quote unquote observing people in their natural habitat, we get to do that digitally through diary studies. And so now that we've covered that, we'll jump really quickly into some of the pros and the cons. So there are some things to consider when we're talking about diary studies. And this is, of course, subjective. So it kind of depends on your situation and your resources. But we'll get into a few that are here. And these are definitely not all of them. But it's really good to understand like what we're kind of getting into before we dive into an actual study. So some of the pros when it comes to diary studies is that you get to do this digitally. as I mentioned before. But another one is that there is a huge learning opportunity here. So there's potential to learn lots about how to conduct the study and just about the information that we're looking for itself. And so very, very cool to kind of get a sense of like what we're looking for in addition to things that we didn't even realize we were looking for before, but that also kind of comes with the con that is also up here as far as synthesis instead of requiring a good amount of effort. So sometimes if we don't have those resources or depending on our constraints, then we may not necessarily have the room or capacity to do a diary study. Another pro that I have up here is that there is an opportunity to establish rapport and build a connection between our users and researchers. And so sometimes we don't have that opportunity as much, at least not in the sense of going over a long period of time with these same people. But diary studies allow us to do that. And then another con that I want to talk about up here is that it cannot and should not be done quickly. So this is not a type of study that we want to do if we are in a rush to learn something. But yeah, that's kind of a sense of what some of the pros and the cons are. But I'm going to kind of pop into what our main focus is today, which are some tools and tips. So some of the tools that can make our lives easier do exist for diary studies, and that's awesome because who doesn't want that? So Gscout is a platform that has been pretty popular, at least in the United States, for diary studies specifically. And there you can have your whole study kind of planned out on this platform, and it helps with analysis and synthesis as well. And so there are pros and cons with the platform as well, but it's kind of like an all-encompassing tool to use for a diary study, which is pretty cool. There's Vox Pop Me. I've never used it, but I've heard other people talk about it. It is basically a tool where you get to do video surveys with people, so they get to answer your survey questions via video. So that's a tool that could be taken advantage of for diary studies, in addition to Obvi, which is more like text messaging participants, and chatbots. But there are also other tools that we can utilize too that a lot of us use on a regular basis to just do regular work that you can use for diary studies too. So depending on how you set it up and how you plan it out, you can use Google Docs, you can use Slack, email, and even shared photo albums. So essentially you just need like a digital platform if you're doing it digitally with a two-way form of communication so that you can communicate back and forth. And essentially, you'll be able to conduct your diary study. Now, the diary study that I conducted not too long ago for Figma was on Slack. So I used mainly Slack to communicate and have our participants submit different entries via the tool. And so it actually worked pretty well. And so we'll get a little bit more into the actual conducting of the diary studies in this next slide. So I have a few helpful tips here that at least helped me when I was conducting my diary study or the diary study for Figma. And I have 5 listed here, and we're going to get into each one of these more specifically, but I'll just read them out really quickly. So first and foremost, setting up is key. So like the effort that's put into setup will definitely give you more wins down the line if there's a lot more effort put in at the beginning. Adding a human touch, always a good idea, no matter what you're doing, but especially in diary studies. Communicating and being flexible, of course, that's kind of a given as far as like how important that is. And gifting and keeping things fresh. There was a con that we didn't go into that was on one of the post-it notes in the presentation, or in a few slides ago in the presentation, where it talked about engagement and the potential loss of engagement as the study continues. And that is definitely something that happens, and gifting and keeping things fresh is a way to combat that. And getting feedback. So of course, getting feedback on like how the study went for participants is really important. So let's dig deeper into these tips. So setting up. Setup is key. And planning is key also. And so for this slide here, the main question that we want to ask ourselves is, what can be done ahead of time? Like, what can we do and plan out now that's going to make our lives super easy, or way more easier than it would be in later down the line after you kick off the study? And so I have an example here on the left as far as like something that I did while planning and setting up, which was just literally planning out what I was going to say. So like I mentioned before, we conducted this study in Slack, and so we had participants submit their entries in Slack. I had announcements that I was shooting out every day in Slack, in addition to questions of the day. And so here on this chart, if you can see, there's like by day, and you can see maybe the first 3 days here, and it's literally just all of the messaging that I want to do. And so it's so much easier to copy paste than it is to type things out. And so I prepared each day of the study with all of the messaging that I needed to send out, in addition to the questions of the day and a checklist. It's a lot easier to like go off of a checklist than it is to try and remember things that you're supposed to do each day, especially when you have other things going on outside of the diary study. And so those checklists definitely helped me. So here on the right, there are just a little more examples of like what we can do ahead of time. And there's definitely more in addition to this, but communication and messaging was something that I needed to do. So in addition to the announcements, the emails that I sent out, everything literally that I wrote out was written out beforehand so that I didn't have to do too much thinking there. Along with the prompts and activities, of course, we want to make sure we know what the goals of the diary study are before like jumping in, and also knowing like what questions that we want to have answered, in addition to the frequently asked questions that our participants may have. And of course, our gifting structure too. And that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later, but just planning that out and scheduling it and making sure we have that together. Adding a human touch. Yes. So here we want to think about, okay, so how can we personalize anything that has to do with this study, right? Like what will make people feel really nice, and like what feels really nice to us? And I think adding that human touch really helps to keep with the engagement, as far as avoiding people dropping off a little later in the study, but then also just making people feel good about like their contributions, because it shouldn't be you just kind of absorbing all of this information and they just providing it. A little back and forth and a little personalization, a little human touch can go a long way. One way I did this was with onboarding. So I think it's super imperative to onboard people onto your diary study. And so what we did was I met with all of the participants before the first day of kickoff, and I introduced myself, I introduced the study, I also had them introduce themselves so that we can put a name to a face, and like have it be like a human interaction and not so much a digital like robot kind of interaction, like just making people feel a little bit more comfortable. We don't all participate in diary studies all the time, so sometimes it can be a little nerve-wracking or anxiety inducing, and so definitely want to make sure that participants felt comfortable, and so we want to do that within our diary studies. And also we answered their questions as well, and that helped me to inform the FAQs that I was talking about before. And so putting those together and providing that as something the participants could use as a resource was something that I did as well. But yeah, adding a human touch to any of these areas and more can really help to boost the success of your diary study. Communicating now. Communicating and being flexible is a must. Of course, we want to communicate like the different messaging and making sure that people are on track, but we also want to make sure we communicate what we want, right? As far as like the entries that participants are going to be submitting. So when it comes to information, we don't want to have participants submit information that's not enough, but we also don't want participants to submit information that is like way too much, because that is going to kick us in the butt by the time we get to analysis and synthesis. So making sure to communicate that as far as like the information that you're looking for, in addition to just communicating about the information that your participants are actually submitting. So during the diary study I conducted, there was a lot of questioning and back and forth as far as like, is this enough information? Am I providing the right information? And so making sure that that communication and those lines of communication are open on your end is really important. And then being flexible, things may need to pivot, things may need to be adjusted in terms of communication and like maybe the messaging that we're using. And so being open to switching it up whenever needed can be really helpful. Gifting and keeping things fresh is also another tip I mentioned before. So here we're thinking, okay, so what can our gifting structure actually look like? What can we consider? There's a few things that we can consider here in terms of like how we're gifting people. So you can choose to pay people the gift at the very end of the study, or you can pay them throughout. We chose to pay them throughout just because that felt like it felt better. We want to make sure we pay people for their time and they're giving us information and doing this thing that they're not really used to doing for 2 weeks. And so definitely wanting people to feel valued and that their contributions are really helping us and like we're a partner in this. I also didn't mention prior to this that this was the first diary study we were doing at Figma. And so when I was communicating with people, we definitely let them know, it's just like, hey, like we're kind of in this with you, kind of testing it out. So we're learning right alongside you, and we want to make sure that you're feeling valued here, because we're partners in this right now. And so this was like one of the ways we did that. And so this chart here on the right is an example of the breakdown that we had in terms of like how we were paying people and like providing the gift. We also had mini gifts where we did a little bit more of a personalization type gift because we were asking questions of the day. We did include questions that did not have anything to do with Figma, but more so getting to know our participants. And so we were able to personalize one of the gifts that we gifted out during the study. And so that was really cool. And it turned out to be a thing that people really liked and appreciated. Also, how do we keep the days from feeling monotonous? Participating in a diary study, especially a longer one, can get boring, right? And so we want to make sure that we're keeping people engaged, and how can we switch it up and keep it fresh? Here on the right is, on the bottom right, is an example of one way that I went about doing that. So it's a calendar, like an advent calendar of sorts, where participants could click on it. It was a Figma prototype. They could click on it to get to their questions of the day. And so it was just like more of a fun, interactive way to start their diary study journey each day. And so, yeah, and it was a little fun to like hide the mini gifts in one of the days as well, just like add a little bit of surprise. So it was something that people enjoyed. And then the last tip, of course, is getting feedback. Because this was our first diary study, we wanted to make sure that we were doing it in a way that participants were enjoying, but then also satisfied with. And so some things that we did get feedback on was on satisfaction, areas of improvement, and any additional comments that they had to add. We definitely don't want this feedback survey to be a long process or hard. So like we only had one of the questions be required because they just spent 2 weeks with us giving us a whole bunch of information. And so why make the feedback survey rigorous? Like no need to do that. But yeah, definitely getting feedback, making sure that the participant understood everything that was going on, but then also like, were they satisfied with how the study was actually run? And are there any ways that we could have improved going forward for when we do diary studies in the future. And so I think getting feedback is definitely a plus when it comes to making sure that you're performing the best way possible. But that is about it. Thank you so much.